The first blow landed on her shoulder, not her face. That was the detail she would remember longest, that even in violence, someone had been precise. She had spent 3 years learning how to disappear inside a life that wasn't hers. That was the job, really. Not the polishing, not the folding, not the ledger. The job was to become air. To move through 38 floors of marble and dark wood without ever once being the reason anyone looked up. The penthouse on Beacon Hill ran on details she would never own. Watches worth more than her yearly rent, 41 of them each logged by hand in a small brown leather ledger no one else was permitted to touch. Chandeliers that turned every surface she cleaned into something that gleamed like it belonged in a different life. She pressed shirts softer than any sheet she'd ever slept under, and every night before she left, she set a silver hairpin on the pressing table, a habit so old she no longer remembered starting it, and checked out of old habit that the tissue-wrapped orange mint candy was still in her coat pocket. Her brother's favorite. He had been dead 2 years. She still carried one every shift, a small, stubborn refusal to let him go entirely. Boston was drowning in sleet that night, the kind of December cold that turned every streetlight into a halo and every breath into smoke. Tamsin Rowe stepped out through the service entrance at 11:40. She always left last. She always left alone. 3 blocks. That was all it was. 3 blocks between the service door and the lit platform of the train station. A walk she'd made alone more nights than she could count, one she knew so well she could have done it with her eyes closed. Tonight, the sleet had already turned to something heavier, and she pulled her collar up and counted the blocks the way she counted everything, automatically, without thinking, the way you count the stairs in a house you've lived in for years. She did not see the 2 men step out of the alley behind the hardware store until they were already between her and the light. The shorter one looked at her collar first, not her face. At the small embroidered logo stitched into the placket of her shirt, the kind only internal staff would recognize. He said 2 words, quietly, almost bored. Ashford's girl. The first punch was aimed at her left shoulder, the spot she always used to carry heavy bags. Deliberate, clinical. They took her phone and her wallet, but they left behind carefully, almost ceremonially, a thin leather bracelet stamped with the number 11. She noticed that even as she fell. She noticed everything. It was the one part of her nobody had ever managed to beat out. She went down into a puddle of dirty slush. As she lay there, one of the men murmured something to the other about an old warehouse in Southend. She caught it the way she caught everything, filed, stored, never spoken aloud. She did not call the police. She got up on her own because getting up on her own was the only thing she had left that belonged entirely to her, and she limped the 2 miles back to her apartment in Dorchester with her shoulder screaming and her lips split and one eye already beginning to swell shut in the dark. By morning, the swelling had bloomed into something ugly and violet. She wore a long-sleeved blouse, buttoned to the throat, foundation pressed carefully over the worst of the bruising, and she clocked in exactly on time the way she always did, because a woman like her did not get to be late, not even the morning after she had been left in an alley to send someone a message she didn't yet understand. In the service elevator, another cleaner looked her up and down, the soft weight of her, the swelling around her eye, the stiff way she held her left arm, and laughed under her breath. "Look at you, dragging that body up here after a beating. Ashford will fire you before the snow melts." Tamsin said nothing. She only closed her hand tighter around the leather ledger she carried against her chest, the way another woman might have carried a child. The elevator doors opened onto the dressing room on the 38th floor. He was already standing there. Kieran Ashford, white shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, the compass tattoo on his right forearm catching the light, the thin line of ink running down the left side of his throat, visible where his collar sat open. He looked at her once, really looked, The swollen eye, the way she favored her shoulder, the careful buttons at her throat that were trying too hard to hide something. Then he looked past her at the woman who had just spoken. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It dropped over the entire floor like a lid closing on a pot. "Say that again, and you will not have a job in any building that carries my name." The cleaner's face went white. She said nothing else. He turned back to Tamsin. His eyes were gray and very cold and entirely direct. "Who hurt you?" 4 words. That was all. But something in the way he said them made the air in the room feel thinner. His phone buzzed once against his chest, soft, barely a vibration, right as the question left his mouth. He glanced down at it for less than a second. 5 words lit the screen from a number with no name attached. "She still has the log." He locked the phone almost before she could register he'd looked at it. But when his eyes came back up to her face, they lingered a beat longer than they had before, as if he were seeing something in her he hadn't let himself see in 3 years. Neither of them noticed the small mechanical whir of the hallway camera outside the dressing room as it rotated 15 degrees on its mount, an angle that only someone with the highest level of internal access could command. Someone, somewhere, was watching this exact moment unfold in real time. 3 seconds later, he had his phone to his ear. "Call the South End crew, now!" He did not look at her when he said what came next. He said it to the window, to the gray Boston morning, to the city itself. "By sunrise, every man who touched you will wish he never learned my name." She stood very still, the ledger pressed against her ribs, and understood, without yet understanding why, that she had not simply been mugged in an alley the night before. She had been hunted, and somehow, impossibly, she was the only one who did not yet know why. They did not let her go home. Bram Coulter, the Mafia boss's silent, gray-haired head of security, a man with a long scar running from his right temple down into his jaw, appeared within the hour carrying a bag of fresh clothes and a first aid kit that looked like it belonged in an ambulance rather than a penthouse. He set both down on the guest suite's dresser without a word and left just as quietly. She noticed his hands weren't quite steady. She filed that too. Tamsin sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed on the 35th floor, a guest apartment she gathered that had never once been used, and pressed an ice pack to her shoulder with her good hand. Her mind would not stop moving. Ashford's girl, the bracelet with the number 11, the warehouse in South End. While Kieran was out handling things, she went through the pockets of her ruined coat one more time and found a folded scrap of paper she hadn't noticed the night before, tucked deep in the lining. An address. South End. The same words the attacker had murmured while she lay in the slush. Her hands were shaking by the time she set it down. She should not have opened the desk drawer in the study. She knew that even as she did it. But 3 years of silence, of being invisible, of watching a man's whole private world pass through her hands without ever once being allowed to ask a single question about it, something in her had finally cracked open alongside her lip. Inside the drawer was an envelope, yellowed at the edges. Her brother's name was written across the front. Leander Rowe. The brother who had died of kidney failure 2 years ago. Inside the envelope, a single blank sheet of paper and 1 line of clean, deliberate print. Debt settled in full, K.A. Her heart was pounding so hard she almost missed the second piece of paper, folded tight beneath the first, smaller, crumpled, urgent. A single line of handwriting, hurried and uneven, in a hand that was absolutely not Kieran Ashford's careful print. She remembers every serial. Do not touch the girl. She read it 3 times before she heard the door. Bram stood in the frame, his face gone the color of old paper. "You need anything?" he asked, his voice too even. She should have said no. Instead, without quite deciding to, she said something else entirely. Something about the blind spot in the 37th floor hallway camera, the one small gap in coverage that the entire security team had somehow missed for weeks. Bram looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger who has just correctly named his oldest secret. Kieran had been standing in the hallway. He had heard every word. He stepped into the room, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier edge. It was low, almost careful. I left that gap exposed on purpose 3 weeks ago. Not to test you. Someone tried to breach that exact blind spot before, and you're the only person who noticed it before they succeeded. He came back at 3 in the morning with dried blood at his cuff, the tattoo at his throat more visible than usual as he bent to set something on the table. He offered no explanation. He only placed a small box in front of her. Inside was the leather bracelet, the one stamped 11, cleaned now, the dirt of the alley gone from every crease. "Keep it," he said. "It's evidence now." Before she could ask what kind of evidence, Bram's phone rang in the hallway. A voice on the other end said only 2 words, flat and final. "She's next." The screen cut to black in her mind before the meaning of it fully landed. Next for what? Another attack? Or a plan that had already been set in motion long before she'd ever walked out that service door in the snow? Kieran said nothing about the phone call that night. He simply told her to sleep and stood outside her door until she did, or until she pretended to, which amounted to the same thing in a house like his. By morning, the guest suite felt less like a cage and more like a strange, suspended kind of shelter. Bram brought coffee instead of a first aid kit. He set it down without meeting her eyes, and she understood that whatever he had known about that note in the drawer, he was not yet ready to say it out loud. "You should eat," he told her, which was not what she had asked, and not an answer to anything. She ate anyway. Her shoulder had stiffened overnight into a deep, dull ache, and still she found herself cataloging the room the way she cataloged everything: the 2 exits, the single window facing the harbor, the fact that the guest suite's lock was newer than any other lock she'd seen in the penthouse, installed sometime in the last 3 weeks. Around the same time he'd left that camera blind spot exposed. She was being managed. Protected and managed in the same breath, and she could not yet tell where one ended and the other began. Kieran found her an hour later in the small library off the main hallway, sitting with her ledger open on her knees. "You don't have to keep doing that," he said. "It's the only thing that's mine," she said before she could stop herself. He didn't answer right away. He crossed the room instead and sat not close in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, watching her the way he might watch a door he wasn't sure was locked. "The men who hurt you," he said finally, "didn't choose you at random. They were paid, specifically, to find the woman who keeps my ledger." She felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Why would anyone care about a book of watch serial numbers? He didn't answer that. Instead, he asked her something that had nothing to do with watches at all. "What do you remember about your brother's illness?" The question landed like a slap, gentler than the ones from the alley, but somehow it hurt more. "He had kidney failure. He died in a hospital in Roxbury 2 years ago. I signed the papers myself." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated that it did. "Did you see the body?" The question hung in the air between them, ugly and enormous. She realized she had never actually been asked that before. She had signed papers. She had received an urn. She had never once been permitted to see her brother's face after the machine stopped. "No," she whispered. "I never did." Something crossed Kieran's face that she had never seen there before. Not the cold control he wore like a second skin, but something closer to guilt. He stood abruptly and left the room without another word, and she sat alone with her ledger and the terrible new shape of a question she had never thought to ask. What if her brother had never actually died at all? That afternoon, Bram took her under instruction, though whose instruction he wouldn't say, to a storage unit 2 blocks from the penthouse, ostensibly to retrieve winter clothes that had already been packed for her without her asking. She understood halfway through the walk that this was not really about clothes. "You knew," she said quietly as they climbed the stairs, "about the note. She remembers every serial. You knew that was there before I found it." Bram's face didn't change, but his silence lasted a beat too long to be nothing. "I wrote it," he said finally. 3 years ago, the day you were hired." She stopped on the stairs. "Why would you write something like that about a stranger?" "Because you weren't a stranger to us," he said. "You were a name on a list before you were ever an employee. Your family's name got you the interview. What you did with the job after that, the ledger, the noticing, all of it, that part was entirely yours." That evening, Kieran called her into his study. He had a folder open on the desk, and for the first time since she'd known him, his hands seemed unsteady as he turned it toward her. "Before you read this," he said, "I need you to understand something. Everything I did to keep a promise, not to hurt you." Inside was a photograph of a warehouse in South End, the exact building whose address she'd found folded into the lining of her coat. Beneath it, a name printed in stark black type. Leander Rowe, status deceased, unconfirmed. "What does that mean?" she said very slowly. "Unconfirmed?" "It means the death certificate was real paper with a real doctor's signature on it. I also know the doctor who signed it was paid to sign it, which means the man in that hospital bed the night the machine stopped may never have been your brother at all." The room tilted. "Then where is he?" "I don't know yet. But if I'm right, your brother has spent 2 years hiding from people who would kill him the moment they knew he was alive. And the only reason you were attacked in that alley is that someone believes you know exactly where he is." "I don't know anything," she said, and it was the truth, and it terrified her more than any lie could have. "You know more than you think," Kieran said quietly. "You just don't know that you know it yet." That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the unfamiliar bed with her ledger open across her lap, running her fingers down page after page of serial numbers she had copied by hand for 3 years, without ever once questioning why. And then she found it. Halfway down a page dated 14 months earlier, tucked between 2 entries for wristwatches worth more than her yearly salary, was a serial number that didn't match any watch case she had ever seen. Something about the sequence felt less like a watch and more like a code. She was still staring at it when Bram's raised voice carried through the wall, sharp with something close to panic, cut off abruptly by the low, controlled sound of Kieran's response. She recognized fear when she heard it, even in the voice of a man who was supposed to be unshakable. She closed the ledger, pressed it to her chest, and understood with a clarity that frightened her more than the alley ever had that whatever was coming next was going to be far larger than a beating in the snow. Before you keep watching, pick a side. Kieran, who protected her for 3 years by never once telling her the truth. Or Leander, who let his own sister bury an empty coffin to keep her safe. One of them owes her an apology he hasn't given yet. Type his name in the comments before the next part starts, Kieran or Leander, and tell us the one thing you'd never forgive. Kieran came for her before dawn. He didn't explain where they were going. She recognized the road signs as they crossed into South Boston, recognized the outline of the warehouse from the photograph in his study the night before. Bram was already there, standing beside 2 men zip-tied to steel folding chairs. Neither man had been struck. Their faces were pale with the particular fear of men who understood exactly whose hospitality they were currently enjoying, the fear that belonged only to people who had crossed a real Mafia boss and lived just long enough to regret it. Kieran stopped in front of the 2 men. Tell her why you chose her. The shorter one trembled. We didn't choose her. We were hired. Anonymous account paid in 3 installments. Find the woman who keeps Ashford's ledger, hurt her enough to be noticed, leave the bracelet. Whose bracelet? We don't know. Said it was supposed to look like it came from somebody else. An old South End crew, one that doesn't exist anymore. The second man, desperate to say something useful before the gag came back, blurted out one final detail. The list also said her book has the number of the old man from South End, the one who died 5 years ago. She went rigid. The strange sequence she'd found the night before. It wasn't a coincidence. It had never been a coincidence. Kieran walked toward a heavy steel door set into the concrete. He knelt, pressed his thumb to a small panel, then paused and looked back at her. The physical lock needs my print, he said. But the combination underneath it isn't mine. It's a number only 2 living people have ever held. One of them is dead. The other has been writing it into a ledger for 3 years without knowing what it was. He recited the sequence from memory. It matched, digit for digit, the entry she'd found the night before. You didn't need the code, he said quietly. You were the code. The door released. Inside the safe, not simply the inheritance papers for Leander Rowe transferred quietly into the name Tamsin Rowe 2 years earlier, but an entire ledger of names the organization had once erased from the world. Her mother's name sat plainly on the 3rd line, unconfirmed. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. I didn't ask who hurt you because I cared, Kieran said. I asked because you were the last key. I'm sorry that both of those things turned out to be true at once. Kieran's cruelty and his devotion have always come from the same source, a man raised to believe that control is the only form of love he's allowed to offer. He needed Tamsin's memory to protect the Empire, and he needed to protect Tamsin because he'd promised her brother he would. 2 loyalties that finally collided the moment the safe opened and he could no longer pretend they were separate. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Tamsin's heart stopped before her mind caught up. Leander. Alive. Taller, thinner, a thin, pale scar across the bridge of his nose, his eyes fixed not on Kieran, but on her. You kept that ledger because I told you to, he said, his voice raw. But I never thought you'd keep our mother's number too. She understood in that single sentence exactly what she had become, without ever choosing it, a living archive of every secret both men had buried. Leander's eyes moved to Kieran, and something hard and furious settled into his face. You used my sister as bait, he said. Now it's my turn. The warehouse fell utterly silent. You've been alive for 2 years, Kieran said finally, and you let her grieve you the entire time? I had no choice, Leander shot back, his voice cracking. The people who wanted me dead needed to believe they'd succeeded. If they'd known I was alive, they would have come for her the day after the funeral instead of 2 years later. They came for her anyway. Because someone talked. Someone inside your own organization sold the truth about me. You could have told me, Tamsin said, her voice, smaller than she wanted, but steadier than she expected. Both of you. You could have just told me. Leander's face crumpled. I was trying to protect you. You let me bury an empty coffin, she said. That was a decision made for me, without me, the same way everyone in my whole life has always made decisions for me. Leander's guilt has never really been about the lie itself. It's about how easy the lie became. Every year he stayed hidden was another year he told himself silence was mercy, when really, it was the only kind of control a frightened, powerless man had left. Standing in front of her now, he isn't just confessing a secret. He's confessing that he chose her safety over her right to know her own life. Kieran was the one who moved first. He crossed the space and held out his hand. We don't have time to relitigate the last 2 years. Someone inside my own organization sold out your sister's location and your survival in the same breath. That person is still out there. If we don't move together right now, we lose the only advantage we have." Leander looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then finally, he took it. The two men shook hands in the cold gray light of the warehouse, and something in the room seemed to exhale. The two hired attackers were handed off to a small crew of Kieran's men, delivered to the nearest precinct with a manufactured trail of evidence. Tamsin was brought back to the penthouse as the sky began to lighten. "You can leave tomorrow," Kieran told her in the elevator. "The debt is cleared, your brother is free." She stood in the living room, coat still damp, and felt the strange, hollow sensation of an ending arriving before she was ready for it. Word moved fast that morning. By 6 a.m., 3 separate crews across the city had already heard that Ashford's people had taken 2 men alive out of an alley job and walked them out of a South Boston warehouse without a mark on them, which meant, in the particular arithmetic of that world, that the Mafia boss had decided to be patient, and patience from him was worse than anything loud. Phones rang in 3 boroughs before the sun was fully up. Men who had never met Tamsin Rowe canceled meetings, rerouted shipments, and told their own people to stay well clear of anything wearing an Ashford watch. None of them knew yet that the true danger hadn't come from outside the building at all. The relief lasted less than 20 minutes. Bram appeared in the doorway, his face drained of color, holding an old envelope gone soft at the corners. Inside was a photocopy of a contract dated 5 years earlier. Marin Quill's signature sat beside a forged version of Leander's. On the back, in ink gone a deep rust brown with age, someone had written a single line: "If the girl remembers, eliminate her first." "The account that hired the 2 men in the alley," Bram said, his voice tight. "We traced it an hour ago, Marin's terminal." Kieran read the note twice. "She staged the attack," he said slowly. "She wanted me to notice what Tamsin could do. She needed me to open that safe to confirm what the ledger was really worth, and once she had that confirmed, Tamsin became a liability instead of a tool." Less than 20 minutes later, at 4:47 in the morning, gunfire cracked through the hallway. Bram went down first shot from behind with his own weapon. The shooter stepped out from the exact blind spot Tamsin had identified days earlier, the trap Kieran had set on purpose, the one meant to catch an intruder before they could do exactly this. It had failed only because the person walking through it had spent 6 months quietly rerouting the very alerts meant to catch her. Marin Quill, the Mafia boss's own personal assistant. "You used your own access to blind your own trap?" Kieran said, his voice shaking with something other than control. "I built half your security system," Marin said, almost bored. "Did you think I wouldn't know exactly where its edges were?" Marin's ambition was never really about money or territory. It was about being underestimated in a different, quieter way than Tamsin ever was. She spent 6 years being the woman who managed a Mafia boss's calendar, while men half as capable were handed empires. And somewhere in that slow erosion, loyalty curdled into a plan she'd been patient enough to wait 5 years to execute. Chaos erupted through the penthouse, doors slamming, someone shouting for a medic, the overhead lights flickering once, twice, as if the building itself had flinched. Tamsin dropped to her knees beside Bram, pressing her hands hard against the wound at his shoulder, warm blood immediately soaking through her sleeve, shockingly hot against her cold fingers. "Stay with me," she said. "Stay with me, Bram." Her voice came out steadier than she felt the same flat, careful calm she'd used walking 2 miles home in the sleet 3 nights before. Bram's eyes found hers, glassy, unfocused, and for one terrible second, he looked at her the way he must have looked at a stranger's daughter once, a long time ago, before this life had hollowed something out of him. "Told you," he rasped, a wet, broken attempt at a laugh. You notice everything. Wish you'd noticed this coming. I'm noticing it now, she said. That's what matters. Maren was seized before she could reach the stairwell, two of Kieran's men closing on her from either side of the hall, her arms wrenched back with a rough efficiency that spoke of long practice. As they dragged her past, her phone slipped from her jacket pocket and clattered to the floor, screen still lit, skidding to a stop at Tamsin's knee. A voice message began to play automatically, the small speaker tinny in the ruined quiet of the hallway. It was Leander's voice, 2 years younger, far more afraid. If anything happens to me, only Tamsin will remember that number. The room froze entirely. Even Maren, held fast between two men twice her size, went very still. As Maren was marched through, she twisted to look Tamsin up and down with a sneer that hadn't dimmed even in defeat. Bram's blood smeared faintly across the toe of her shoe from where she'd stepped past him without pausing. A nobody who does laundry, and she thinks she gets to stand here? Tamsin did not step back. Her hands were still slick and warm from holding Bram's wound closed, and she stood anyway, rising slowly, deliberately, the way she'd learned to rise from a puddle of dirty slush 3 nights ago on her own, because it was the only thing that still belonged to her. She walked forward, set her leather ledger down on the heavy wooden table, and opened it to the exact page where Maren's forged signatures matched serial number for serial number. Then she turned the page again, to the log of every internal call Maren had placed from Kieran's private line over the past 6 months. You called me invisible for 3 years, Tamsin said quietly, and the quiet of it landed harder than shouting ever could have. Invisible people notice everything. That was always your mistake. Maren's authority collapsed in the space of a single turned page. Something in her face gave way, not fear exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 5 years building a wall no one had bothered to notice, only to watch it fall to a girl she'd handed coffee to every morning. Kieran stepped to Tamsin's side, close enough that she could feel the tension still radiating off him, the leftover current of violence with nowhere to go. By sunrise, every man in this city will be terrified, he said, but the one I'm most afraid of is you walking out that door. She turned toward the window. Outside, the sky over Boston had begun to pale into the thin gray of early dawn, the same color it had been the morning after the alley, as if the city only ever offered her one kind of light. She did not know yet herself whether she would stay or go. Within 2 hours, Maren Quill's entire network had been dismantled. Accounts frozen, safe houses emptied, communications severed, all of it made possible by the quiet records inside a ledger no one had ever imagined could hold this much power. She did not run. She stood in the living room until the last of it was finished, until the ambulance carrying Bram had pulled away toward Massachusetts General, its siren fading down Beacon Hill until the street swallowed the sound whole. Someone had draped a blanket over her shoulders at some point. She never found out who, and she sat wrapped in it on the edge of the couch, watching a cleanup crew she didn't recognize move through the hallway with the practiced silence of men who had done this before, more than once for this family. The quiet did not last long. At 7:30, one of Kieran's men reported a second, smaller account tied to Maren had gone active for less than 90 seconds before shutting itself down. A dead man's switch closed the moment her arrest was confirmed. Tamsin understood in that stretch of waiting that safety was never going to arrive all at once. It would come in pieces, the way everything else in her life had. Kieran spent that morning on the phone in low-clipped sentences she'd learned not to try to follow, the particular shorthand of a man managing a war he'd started fighting before she was even hired. Twice she caught him glancing at her across the room, as if checking that she was still there, still solid, still real. The third time, he didn't look away when she caught him. You should sleep, he said finally, crossing the room to crouch in front of where she sat, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved fresh into the lines around his eyes. I don't think I remember how, she admitted, and it surprised her how easily the truth of it came out. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply sat down on the floor in front of the couch, his back against its frame, close enough that his shoulder rested against her knee, and stayed there in silence, until eventually, without either of them deciding it, she did sleep, sitting upright, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, in the one place in the building that had somehow, impossibly, come to feel safe. Dawn broke fully over the rooftop terrace an hour later. Kieran stood alone at the railing, his sleeves still rolled from the night before, the compass tattoo on his forearm dulled under the flat morning light. Below them, the harbor had gone the color of pewter gulls wheeling low over water that didn't care what had almost happened 3 floors up. Tamsin came to stand beside him, her left shoulder still aching, the same shoulder that had taken the first blow 3 nights before. The wind off the water was sharp and cold, and she found she didn't mind it after everything cold felt honest in a way the penthouse's careful warmth never quite had. He did not apologize. "I used you," he said. "You can hate me for it." "I already did," she said quietly. Then I stopped. He turned to look at her properly then, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence stretching comfortably between them instead of straining. She thought about asking him why a man who could order 2 hired attackers zip-tied to chairs without raising his voice had needed 3 years to work up the nerve to ask her a single, honest question. She didn't ask. Some answers, she was learning, arrived on their own time. Before she left the rooftop, she drew out a small USB drive from the lining of her boot. "I copied the ledger," she said, handing it to him, her fingers brushing his for the first time without either of them pulling away first. "Encrypted with the serial number of the oldest watch in your collection, in case something happened to me before anyone figured out what I was actually carrying." There was one file on the drive she hadn't meant to open. A voice recording 2 years old. Kieran's voice, speaking privately to Leander. "If anyone ever touches his sister, I will burn this whole city down." She understood then that the words he'd spoken in the elevator 3 days earlier had not been the fury of a single terrible morning. It had been a promise, kept ready for 2 years, loaded and waiting like a gun in a drawer nobody was supposed to know about. Kieran took the drive from her hand, and for the first time in 3 years, his fingers visibly trembled in the light of the rising sun. "2 years ago, your brother told me what your mother's disappearance had done to both of you," he said. "I made him a promise that day. I didn't know yet that keeping it would mean lying to you for 2 years to do it." He looked down at the drive, turning it once between his fingers before closing his fist around it. "I've broken a lot of promises in this life. I told myself that one couldn't be one of them. I never once asked whether the lie itself might be the thing that broke you instead." "It didn't break me," she said. "It just meant I had to find my own way to the truth. I'm better at that than anyone gave me credit for." "I know," he said. "I think that's the part that scared me most." Leander appeared on the rooftop one final time. He handed her a plain envelope, a deed to the small Dorchester apartment where she had lived for years, quietly transferred into her name 2 years earlier by Kieran himself. His hands, she noticed, still had the faint tremor of a man who'd spent 2 years flinching at footsteps in hallways. "There's one more thing," Leander said. "Kieran's already started pulling the old South End records, the ones tied to Mom's file. It's not much yet, just a few names, a few dates that don't match, but it's more than we had yesterday." She held the deed in one hand and that thin new thread of hope in the other and said nothing at all. Not because she had nothing to say, but because for the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence wasn't something being kept from her. It was something she was choosing to sit inside, on her own terms, until she was ready to break it. In the days that followed, the city moved on, unaware of how close it had come to a different kind of mourning. Bram recovered slowly, the bullet, having missed anything vital, by a margin the surgeon called more than once lucky in a way I don't usually get to say out loud. Tamsin visited him on the third day, a paper cup of the terrible hospital coffee in each hand, and found him propped up against a bank of pillows, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him, and somehow more himself for it. "You wrote that note the day I was hired," she said, setting one cup down on his tray table. "You knew who I was before I ever touched a single watch. Your name got you the interview," Bram said, voice still rough from the tube they'd pulled out that morning. "Everything after that, the ledger, the noticing, the way you never once complained in 3 years, that part was just you." He paused, studying her over the rim of the cup. "For what it's worth, I'm glad it was you who found that blind spot. Not because it saved the operation, because it meant somebody in that building was finally paying attention to the right things." 3 weeks passed. Boston had shifted fully into winter by then, the harbor rimmed with ice at its edges, the kind of cold that made even the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows feel like a held breath against the weather outside. Tamsin still worked at the penthouse. Though the night shifts had ended, she chose to stay 3 nights a week instead, on her own terms, in her own time, and there was a particular satisfaction in that phrase now that hadn't existed 3 weeks earlier. On her own terms. She said it to herself sometimes, quietly, just to feel the shape of it in her mouth. Bram was back on his feet by the 2nd week, moving slower, favoring his right side, but present again in the hallways, in the way he always had been, a fixed point in the building's architecture, as permanent as the load-bearing walls. He'd started without saying why, leaving the guest suite's door unlocked at night. She never asked. She understood it as its own kind of apology. Leander had taken a small apartment 2 neighborhoods over, close enough to visit without needing to disappear again, close enough that some mornings she'd find him waiting outside her building with 2 coffees and no particular reason for being there at all, just the quiet, stubborn insistence of a man relearning how to simply be somewhere without hiding. One quiet morning, she found a small antique watch waiting on her desk, the only piece that had never carried a serial number in 3 years of cataloging every single one that passed through her hands. Inside the caseback, engraved in small, careful script, "For the one who kept the list." She turned it over twice in the morning light before she trusted herself to speak. She did not cry, though something in her chest pulled tight and held. "Does this mean I still have a job?" "It means you have a choice," Kieran said. "Every single day." That afternoon, alone in the small library off the main hallway, the same room where he'd once asked her whether she'd seen her brother's body, she opened the back panel of the watch out of old habit. The same restless curiosity that had once found a serial number that didn't belong among 40 other entries, a hidden compartment released with a small, satisfying click. A keycard to a sub-basement level even Bram had never been permitted to enter. She sat very still with it in her palm for a long moment before she found Kieran on the terrace, the card held out flat on her open hand, like something that might still be a trick. "I need someone who remembers everything," Kieran said, watching her face rather than the card. "And I only trust you." The card, he explained, would trigger a full wipe of the organization's backup data unless it received her voice confirmation within 72 hours, a failsafe built not against outsiders, but against exactly what Marin had almost become, a safeguard that only worked because it depended entirely on a woman with nothing to gain from betraying it. "If I refuse?" she said quietly, turning the card once between her fingers. "You lose everything." "Not just everything," he said, and something wry and tired flickered at the corner of his mouth, the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him in 3 weeks. "I become a man hunted by his own system before dawn on the 3rd day, which I've come to learn is a very particular kind of mourning." "Then, I suppose," she said finally, "you'd better start being someone worth remembering for." That evening, on the same rooftop where the ledger had first left her hands, Kieran found her watching the last of the daylight fade over the harbor, the water gone the color of old brass, the first hard stars just beginning to show over the water. She heard him before she saw him, the particular weight of his footsteps on the terrace stone, unhurried now in a way they never used to be. He came to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, letting the cold do the talking, letting 3 weeks of unbearable events settle into something almost like peace. Then, quietly, almost like a question, he was asking for the first time instead of the last, he said the same 4 words he had said in a dressing room 3 weeks earlier. "Who hurt you?" This time she understood he wasn't asking about the men in the alley or any of the wounds already named and settled. He was asking so he would always be the first to know, the first to stand beside her, not because she needed protecting, but because he never again wanted to be the last man in the city to notice. "No one," she said. "Not tonight." She reached for his hand, and for once neither of them let go first. Bram healed fully back to his old, watchful self by the following month, though he'd started quietly teaching Tamsin the parts of building security no one had ever thought to show her. Not because she'd asked, but because he'd decided somewhere in that hospital bed that a woman who could spot a blind spot no professional had caught deserved to understand the whole system, not just the ledger inside it. Leander visited when he could, still adjusting to a life where he no longer had to disappear to keep the people he loved safe, still catching himself some mornings checking exits in restaurants out of old habit before remembering he didn't have to. And somewhere in a records room 2 floors beneath the penthouse, a small file marked with their mother's name sat open on a desk, waiting patiently for whatever truth still remained to be found. Tamsin kept her ledger. She always would. But these days its pages held something new alongside the old serial numbers and buried secrets. Small notes of her own, the outline of a life she was finally building on her own terms. In the end, this story is about a truth most of us learn far too late in life. Quiet women are not invisible women. They are simply the ones nobody bothered to really look at. If you're sitting with your coffee this morning, widowed, retired, or just tired of people deciding things for you, here's something practical, not a slogan. Start keeping your own ledger. Not secrets, just a habit. Write down what you notice, what you're owed, what you were never told. When your kids, your bank, or your doctor make a decision for your own good without asking first. Borrow Kieran's 4 words. Ask who hurt you and why nobody told you. Ask it out loud at your own kitchen table this week. Dignity isn't loud. It's a woman who keeps her own records and trusts her own eyes even when the whole room has decided she doesn't matter. That was always enough to change everything. If Tamsin's journey moved you, tell us in the comments which part of her transformation hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that quiet strength is never the same thing as weakness. Like this video if you believe the ones we underestimate are so often the ones who change everything. And subscribe because there are more women like Tamsin waiting to have their stories told.